Hi, everyone. Welcome. As you're logging on, tell us where you're watching from in the chat. We'd love to know. Ooh, Los Angeles.
Another time zone.
Yeah. Greetings from Wilmington, Baltimore.
And I, of course, am in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So,
Yeah. Greetings from New Jersey. All right, we already have our first question. How long will the exhibit be at the museum? Bernice, you want to share that?
Till 2025 at least.
Yeah, we did extend it, so that's exciting.
And I would really encourage those of you who have not seen it, I imagine some of you may have, to see it in person because it's really pretty stunning.
I agree. Well, it's 7:02, so I guess we'll get started. So welcome to tonight's virtual program with the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore. Again, thank you so much for logging on. We love seeing where everyone is watching us from. That's always exciting. Tonight we are very excited to be doing a tour of the exhibition Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family with Bernice Steinhardt. The fabric stories of Holocaust survivor Esther Krinitz that recount her memories as a teenager in Nazi Poland are so beloved, and we are really grateful to also be able to share them virtually with all of you. Bernice will take questions from the audience at the end of the presentation, so you can certainly drop your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll get to those at the end. I also want to mention that closed captioning is available for this presentation. You just have to enable it at the bottom of the Zoom, but we do pay for closed captioning, so it should be available. And now I'm really excited to introduce you to the daughter of Esther Krinitz, Bernice Steinhardt.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's really an honor for me to be able to share something of my mother's art and story with you. Let me begin by just telling you a little bit about my mother. She was born in a little village in the center of Poland called Mniszek, and she was 12 years old when the Germans invaded Poland, and they came straight to her village and occupied it for 3 years. And in 1942, when my mother was 15, they ordered all the Jews of her village and the surrounding area to report to a train station, but my mother refused to go. She instead took her 13-year-old sister, and the two of them said goodbye to their family and never saw them again. Now, as I was growing up, I heard my mother's stories of her childhood, of her survival. I can't actually remember a time when I didn't know my mother's stories. But when she was about 50, she decided that she wanted me and my sister to see what her home and her family looked like. She had never been trained as an artist. She didn't know how to draw, but she could sew anything. She had been trained as a dressmaker when she was only 8 years old. She was apprenticed to the village dressmaker. So she took a large piece of fabric and she filled it all in with stitches. If you could go to the first slide, please. And this was the picture that she created. It's quite large. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet. And she put herself down in the bottom left corner, carrying water over her shoulders up from the river. Her sister, Manya, waits for her at the top of the hill. Her parents are in front of the house with the two younger girls. and her brother Reuben is standing by the horse and wagon. And her house with the thatched roof, her neighbor's house, all of these details she included. And she was really pleased with this picture when she finished, and she gave it to me. So next slide, please. So she, of course, had to make a companion for my sister because she was very fair-minded. And in this is the view from the other side of the road down by the river. And she and her brother are swimming in the river, and her sisters are standing on the banks and with the animals, the ducks and the geese and the cows, farmers coming in off the field. This is entirely filled with stitches. So this one went to my sister Helene. And after she finished these two, she didn't do any more of these memory pictures for another 10 years. She was, in the meantime, she had a business. She had a women's clothing store, which was then in Frederick, Maryland. And she had two young grandchildren. My children came along during this period. And so she was very busy making things for them. But about 10 years later, when she was in her early 60s, she went back to these memory pictures. And once she started, she never paused. They just, she just worked on them continuously, one after the other, for roughly a 10-year period until close to the time that she died. She did not create them in chronological order. I'm going to show them to you in chronological order, but she created them in what I call her psychological order. She did the pictures that were most emotional, the ones that she felt she really needed to express, the memories that she really needed to express first, and then moved around in time, backward and forward, until she had created 36 of these memory pictures altogether. So next slide, please. Several of them are from the period of time before the war, and in the happy years of her childhood. And here she remembers a time when she and her brother and sisters were on their way to their grandparents' house. This was at the time of a Jewish holiday called Shavuos or Shavuot. Usually occurs falls in June. So this is in 1938, I believe. And her brother had made a pair of stilts for her. And she used to say that he was the toy maker and she was the toy tester. And so here, she always thought of herself as something of a tomboy also. So here she's walking on the stilts as they go to their grandparents' house. And she would say, here, she was so proud of the fact that she made it all the way to their grandparents' house without falling. So one of the things that I love about this picture, there are many things that I particularly love about this picture. The colors are just incredibly vivid. This blue border. This is the only picture that she ever did in which she stitched embroidery, a motif in the borders. But what I also love about this picture is the way that she remembered herself as leading the way, head and shoulders above her brother and sisters, and leading the way. It was just so characteristic of her personality, her character, that she would remember herself in this way. Next slide, please. Here's a detail. In these pictures, everything you can see, everything stands on the surface of the picture. The three-dimensionality of these photographs is really amazing. You can see every stitch. Next slide, please. There are several pictures that she did of her life before the war. This is, though, the picture that defines the beginning of the war for my mother. This is in September 1939. My mother had heard that there was a unit of German soldiers that were coming into the village. So she and two friends ran to her grandparents' house, which was at the entrance to the village. And you see the girl standing in the lower left corner and watching as one of the soldiers dismounts and grabs her grandfather off the steps of his house and cuts off his beard. If you go to the next slide, please. Here you can see the detail of it. And this is the way, Jewish men were identified as Jewish because they all wore beards. It wasn't common among Polish or other men. So when they saw a man with a beard, they knew he was Jewish. And the ultimate sign of disrespect to cut off his beard while his granddaughter watched. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, they occupied the village for 3 years, the Germans. And here, this was, I think, in July of 1940, my mother one day developed this terrible toothache. And she had heard that there was a dentist in the German camp, but she knew that she couldn't go to see the dentist as herself. They would never have helped a Jewish girl. So she got a friend to go with her, a Polish girl, and she taught her friend to say in German, "My sister has a toothache." My mother didn't want to speak German because she knew that her Yiddish accent would give her away. So she taught her friend to speak, her Polish friend to speak in German. And here she recalls the dentist pulling out her tooth, after which he gave her a piece of chocolate, presumably for being a good patient. And then she went home and told her mother what she had done. She didn't want to say anything about it beforehand because she knew her mother would never give her permission to go. So after the fact, she told her what she had done. And her mother was shocked that she had had the nerve to do this. And when my mother would tell this story many, many years later, she was shocked that she had had the nerve to do this. But she was desperate, and she was in pain, and she was desperate. And in many ways, this was a kind of foreshadowing of what she was able to do later on to save her life. Next slide, please. This is now in 1941, on a beautiful June day. My mother and her sister, by this point, well, the Jews were no longer allowed at this time to own livestock. And her parents made their living by buying and selling, by trading livestock. Her father was a horse trader, and he used to travel around the countryside. Her mother sold poultry at the market. So their livelihood was cut off, and the girls had to go to work. And they went to work for Polish farmers, tending their animals. And here my mother and Manya have taken the cows that they were tending to the good pasture down by the Vistula River, as I said, this beautiful day in June. And when they got there, my mother could see that through the trees, they were next to this labor camp. Before the war, it was a camp in which prisoners were brought to rebuild the earthen dam over the Vistula River. But here, which would get flooded and the dam had to be rebuilt. But here the Germans had turned the camp into a slave labor camp for young Jewish boys and men. And my mother could see how they were being treated as she looked through the trees. And she could see one boy being led into the birch forest when he was too exhausted to work. And she heard shots, gunfire throughout the time that she stood there. Now, when my mother made these pictures, she never gave titles to them. But when I saw this picture, I immediately thought of it as heaven and hell. On the one side is this beautiful scene of spring or early summer with trees bearing fruit, flowers in bloom. The grass is so lush and vibrant green. And on the other side, it's almost colorless. And there's this frenzy of brutal activity and terror. And so the contrast of these two sides of the picture is just stunning. And to me, I've always thought that it perfectly captured the experience of war, both as it would be seen from one of its victims. Next slide, please. So this is now October 1942, the day in which it's October 15th. The Jews were ordered, the Jews of Nishik and the whole surrounding area were ordered to report to the train station in Krasnik at some distance. And they were told that they had to leave their homes by 10 o'clock that morning. Anyone who was still in their homes after that point would be shot. The night before, my mother decided that she did not want to go. She cried and wept, and she begged her father to think of someone that she could go to, a friend of his, another Polish farmer who she could work for. Remember, she and Manya had been working for Polish farmers, and so her thought was if they could just go someplace to another village and find a friendly person, that she and Manya could survive there. Now, I say survive. I don't think she knew, I don't think any of them knew exactly what was going to happen to them. But having lived under German occupation for 3 years, my mother knew nothing good was going to happen. And so finally, her father thought of a friend who could, in another village, who the girls could go to. His name was Stefan, and he lived in the village of Dombrova. So here they are saying goodbye to their family. And this was one of the first pictures that my mother did. And you can see it's still fairly two-dimensional. She hadn't yet learned perspective, but she captures the emotion of this leave taking. And then in the next picture, this is, again, she returned to the leave taking. She always said that that earlier picture of leave taking was the most difficult one she did of all the 36 that she did, because it was the last time that she saw her family. And yet she went back 10 years later, and you can see now that was one of the first pictures my mother did. This is one of the last pictures that she did. And you can see how over that 10-year period, how much she learned just from a technical perspective. well, she learned perspective, and she also grew much more confident in her ability to create more complex compositions. So interestingly, in this scene, she and Manya are already almost out of the picture in the distance on this road, following a woman that their mother had paid to take them to Stefan's house in Dąbrowa. And in the foreground are her parents getting ready to board the wagons. Her brother and her two youngest sisters were, well, the two girls were already in the wagon. Her brother is standing alongside of it. So she imagined in this picture what it was like from her parents' point of view, since this was not a scene that she herself actually saw. And she imagined what it was like for her parents to have sent off their two children to say goodbye to them, not knowing that they would ever see them again. So it's a very moving picture. Next one, please. Well, as it turned out, the neighbor who was supposed to take them to Stefan's house took them to her sister's house in the village and told them to wait there for her, and she left. And so my mother, Esther, and Manya were waiting for her, and my mother began to get worried because she was taking a long time, and there was then a bounty on Jews. So if you were Polish and you turned in a Jew, you could get a kilo of sugar or, some reward. And so my mother feared that that was what this neighbor was planning. And so she took Manya, and the two of them left the neighbor's house, and they joined the procession of Jews on the road on their way to the train station. And they saw quickly their cousin Dina, who was traveling on the road, walking on the road with her baby. And Manya was so happy to see Dina. Manya never wanted to go with Esther. She just wanted to stay with the family. And so when she saw Dina, she had high hopes that she would be able to reunite with her family, with her parents, and continue on the journey with them. But at a certain point on the road, Esther realized they were getting close to the train station, and she just couldn't endure it. She balked, and she started to pull Manya off the road to go towards Dąbrowa, to Stefan's house. And Manya didn't want to go. She wanted to stay with Dina. And it wasn't until Dina said, "Manya, go with Esther," that she listened, and she agreed to go off with my mother. And it was the same when they were leaving their parents. It wasn't until their mother told Manya to go with Esther that she agreed to go. So I've always said that Manya survived because she listened, and my mother survived because she didn't. Next picture, please. Just something to note. My mother saved these pieces of fabric that the two girls are wearing, this sort of turquoise and darker blue print. And so she used it as she was aware of continuity, and she used the same fabric in all of the pictures that she did of this day and the following days of their journey when they left their home. And so what's interesting is that at the point at which she created that first picture of her leave-taking from her family, she already had in her mind that she was going to continue telling the story. And so she set the fabric aside, and she had this idea that she was going to that there was going to be a narrative to follow, sort of a thread, so to speak. Next picture, please. So here they've arrived at Stefan's house in Dombrova, and he invites them in. They throw themselves in his arms. He puts them up. He tells them not to worry, that he'll look after them. And he puts them up in his attic, and they're stringing tobacco. You can see them up in the attic. And then they stay there for a couple of days, until on the third day, he calls them down for breakfast, and he tells them that they have to leave, that everyone in the village of Nishik knows that they came to him, and if the Germans come, they'll kill the girls, they'll kill him, they'll burn down his farm. They can't stay, they have to leave. So they head off down the road. It's into the pouring rain, until they finally come to the forest, and there they find shelter, and you can see them hanging up their boots to dry as the sun comes out. And this is when my mother realizes that they cannot survive as Hersch's daughters, as themselves, any longer. And so she makes up these identities for them as these Polish Catholic farm girls, Józia and Josefina and Maria Grochowiecka, and a whole story about how they came from another town on the other side of the Vistula River. They were separated from their family, and they were looking for work. And so with that story, they went from one village to another. Can you get forward to the next slide, please? The first couple of villages they came to, people wanted to see papers, which of course they didn't have. And so they just kept going until they came to this village of Grabovka, where no one asked them for papers, and they were willing to give them work. So my mother went to work for this elderly farmer whose wife was sick and needed help. Manya worked for the sheriff's mother. And here you see Esther on another beautiful day in June. She's tending the garden that she planted when these two Nazi soldiers walk in, just trampling on the vegetables there. And they started to talk to my mother and try to engage her. And of course, my mother could understand what they were saying, but she just feigned ignorance and kept her head down. And she was terrified of this encounter. And suddenly the bees, which the farmer kept, and you can see the beehives in the background, the bees started swarming the soldiers. And the next slide, please. And they just kept swarming around the soldiers until they finally drove them off. And my mother would always say this was the day that the bees saved her, because they did what nobody else could. They could drive off the soldiers. But I wanted to show you, among many other things, just how perfect these little bees are. My mother made many of them all over the beehives, and then swarming around in the garden. And each one is just perfect. It's this incredible attention to these small details that I think bring the pieces to life. Next slide, please. So I'm skipping over a big period of time here. In 1944, the Russians were moving westward, and they came through her village, pushing the Germans back, and they came through the village of Grabovka. And after and liberated the village and all the other villages on their path. And after a couple of months, my mother decided to go back to Mniszek to see if anyone had returned. And when she got there, there were no Jews, but one of her Polish neighbors told her that she thought that perhaps the Jews had been taken to this concentration camp called Majdanek, which is still in the city of Lublin, not terribly far from where my mother lived. So on her own, my mother made her way to Majdanek. And you can see her at the bottom of the picture in her yellow dress, entering the camp. And we went back to Majdanek in 1999 on a trip to Poland with my mother and my aunt, a big family trip, my kids, my cousin. And we went to Majdanek, and it is a huge camp. And all the main buildings are spread out over quite a wide area. So in this picture, my mother compressed the main features, these barracks, the crematorium, the gas chamber, and at the top of the picture, this hill of giant cabbages growing on a bed of human ashes. And the camp had been liberated by the Red Army. My mother included the soldiers, some of the soldiers in the picture. And after they gave her a tour of the camp, my mother joined the Polish Army, which was then under the Red Army command. And with the Army, and my mother was 17 years old at the time, and with the Army, she traveled to Berlin. Next slide, please. Again, I'm skipping over time here. So after she got to Germany, she went back to, and the war was ended, she went back to Poland to get Manya. And the two of them returned to Germany to a DP, displaced persons camp, refugee camp in the American zone in Germany. And that's where my mother met my father, and my aunt met her husband, also both Polish survivors. And my father had relatives and some cousins in the United States. So he applied to emigrate to the States. But while they were waiting for their visas, my father went to Belgium to find work, and that's where I was born. So here, our little family, my mother, my father, and me in that little splash of pink on my father's shoulder, we arrive in New York Harbor. And of course, the iconic Statue of Liberty. And my father's cousin, Clara, who was instrumental in arranging for our immigration, she came to greet us. And as we all looked over to the Statue of Liberty, my father's cousin, Clara, turned to me and she said to me, my dear child, this will be your America. So there was this feeling that my mother remembered so vividly of freedom and belonging and escape from this war and death into the welcoming arms of the Statue of Liberty. And yet, it's important to remember that in our own time, the United States, the Statue of Liberty, and the United States have not been always so welcoming. We did a program with families from immigrant families from Mexico. And after they learned about my mother and saw her art, they created their own story cloth images of their coming to America. And some of the scenes stood in incredible contrast whereas my family was so warmly received, some of these other families were facing incredible danger at the border. They were turned away, they were shot, they were captured. It was a very different experience that they depicted from the one that my mother depicted in this picture. So I think it's important to remember that America has been and should continue to be the land of the free and the welcoming. Next slide, please. This is now the first home that we had in New York. We went to, we had an apartment in Brooklyn, and in the backyard of the house that we were living in, there was this old overgrown sour cherry tree. And every summer when the cherries came out, my mother would climb to the top of the tree. I'll show you in a minute. And she would pass these buckets of sour cherries down to me and my sister. Now, among my mother's many talents, she was a fantastic cook. And so when she saw these cherries, she saw all these possibilities of cherry pies and toppings for blintzes, and she would make vishniak, a kind of cherry liquor. So there was no cherries were wasted. And you can see in the back of the picture, there's a neighbor boy who's looking over the fence. My sister and I were the envy of all the kids in the neighborhood because our mother could climb trees. If you would go to the next slide. Here she is with a neighbor boy looking on, hidden in the branches, passing the buckets down to us. And so when my mother, in the caption to this picture, she said that every time she climbed the tree, she would remember this conversation with her grandmother when she was a little girl. Her grandmother would tell her, Esther, when you grow up, you're going to go to America, because in America, money grows on trees. And so every time she climbed this tree, and she told her grandmother, she said, but grandmother, I'm really good at climbing trees. So every time she climbed this tree, she would remember this conversation with her grandmother. Next slide, please. So altogether, my mother made 36 of these pictures. There are obviously many more than the ones I showed you this evening. But I wanted you to see, if you haven't already, I wanted you to see the gallery where all these works are exhibited at the American Visionary Art Museum. And we've had many, many exhibitions. I think this is the fourth one we've had actually at AVAM. But the work has traveled across the United States. It's traveled to Canada. It's been to Poland. I think altogether over 40 museums and cultural centers. And this is the one, this exhibition is the one that I think is the most powerful, the most beautiful. The museum created this replica of Esther's house in the center of the gallery, with the cow and her dog and lace curtains in the windows and a thatched roof. When I first heard about it, I thought it was just amazing, and that it was going to be incredibly beautiful. And it is, it really is. And you might get some notion of the scale of the pictures, seeing them in this photograph. So the next picture, I want to show you some other pictures, other artwork that's in the gallery, that's part of this exhibition, which is called Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family. So we included in the exhibition several pictures that document other genocides. This is one by an artist named Lily Yeh, who actually did 2 pictures dealing with the genocide in Rwanda. The other one that I didn't show you is of kind of a pastoral scene of village life in Rwanda before the genocide, and then how quickly it turned into this horror, this nightmare of slaughter. And so she has these 2 paintings side by side that hang in the gallery. I also wanted to mention Lily was invited to Rwanda to work with the villagers who had never grieved in a public way for the dead of their village. And she was invited to come and help them create a memorial to the dead of this community. And when she left, she brought with her a copy of the book, which I'll show you in a minute, of my mother's artwork. So she took as one source of her inspiration Esther's art and story. Next slide, please. This is a piece by a Native American woman, Judy Tallwing, who lives in Baltimore and is an amazing artist. And here, this is, I'm not remembering the title exactly, but the theme of it is peace. And she included in this picture thousands of small beads to commemorate the experience of her people. And it's a prayer for peace. Next slide, please. This is a story cloth. I mentioned to you that we've had workshops with families, immigrant families particularly, and others, teachers, to create story cloths about their experiences of coming to America. And this was done by a Guatemalan woman named Ingrid Smith here in Santa Fe, which is where my husband and I have a second home and spend the summers. And it's just a very beautiful piece that tells the story of how she left her beautiful home in Guatemala, came to Santa Fe with her 2 children in search of a better life, and shows them experiencing the snowfall for the first time. And then her difficulties in finding work and being accepted as a teacher in the last panels. So next slide, please. I will show you in a minute the address of our website, but really encourage you to visit our website, artandremembrance.org, and maybe somebody can put it in the chat. And this is one of the resources, one of the many resources that are on the website. Here, this is a video tour that includes all of the 36 pieces that Esther did, plus an introduction. They're short, they're each a minute or less. I narrate them, and they describe the narrative describes something about the picture, a little bit about what's happening in the picture, but also some background of what my mother had in mind, or my own recollections of what was happening as she was creating these pieces. So it has a lot of background information about my mother and her creation as well. And these are beautiful videos that were done by the videographer for the film that was that we also have on our website. And I neglected to put a slide from, or even a clip from the film, but I would definitely encourage you to go to the website. There's a 30-minute film, a beautiful award-winning film about Esther and her art. And it features interviews with my mother, so you can hear her telling her story. The film is called Through the Eye of the Needle, and you can, it's on YouTube, but you can link to it through our website, and I would really encourage you to do it. If you come to the museum, you can also view the film in the gallery. It's on a continual loop in the gallery. It's only 30 minutes, so you can stay and see the whole thing. Next slide, please. This is the cover of the book that we have, Memories of Survival, which also, it has most of the pieces. It's a beautiful book that we publish, Art and Remembrance, and you can find it in the gift shop at AVAM at the museum, or you can order it online through our website, or just go directly to Amazon. So Memories of Survival. And I think the last slide, please. Here's the website, artandremembrance.org. And as I said, we have just an incredible wealth of resources. We have many resources for educators on the website. There's an education page that has a series of lesson plans that deal with the themes that are raised in Esther's story, and they're geared towards mostly middle and high school students. So I would, if any of you are teachers or have friends or family who are teachers, I would encourage you to share the link to the website with them as well. And so with that, I think I'll just turn it over back to Becca, and I would be, again, I want to say that it's been my pleasure to be able to share this work with you, and a pleasure and an honor. And so I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Bernice. Yeah, if anybody has questions, just drop them in our chat. I have a question just to get us started. How long do you think Esther spent on each of her works, approximately?
My most frequently asked question.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I mentioned earlier that my mother did almost all of these pieces over a 10-year period. And it, as you might imagine, some pieces are bigger, some are smaller, as you can see. And so there was differing amounts of time that it took. And also, my mother had a business. I mentioned she had a women's clothing store in Frederick. So she was working in the evenings and weekends and slow times in the store. But I figure on average, since she did actually 34 pieces over a 10-year period, it took her about 3 to 4 months for each one. That's a rough estimate.
Let's see, another question. Did your mom have any artists that she admired or that you think may have influenced her? That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. I think there were a few paintings that she really felt drawn to, and artists as well. Her favorite artist was Vincent van Gogh. She loved all of his paintings. She loved the color. And if you think about it, it's sort of a natural, if you think about the way she did her work, there's a natural affinity there for his color and his love of nature and the kinds of landscapes that he did. And flowers too. You know, my mother, if you look at each of her pictures, there's always something growing. If it's not in full view, it's in a corner on the ground. And so she loved his flower pictures too. She did a needlepoint of his painting of irises. She loved that very much. And I don't know if you're familiar with this painting by a French artist named Millet, also a 19th century painter, who did a picture of the gleaners, of these farmers in the field gathering hay in sort of a group. And she loved that painting because it was so reminiscent of scenes that were so familiar to her at home. There's a picture, in case you're interested, there's a picture that she did of women of Passover, of women in her village making matzahs. And the way that they're oriented and lined up is reminiscent, although I'm sure she was not conscious of this, but reminiscent of the way these farmers are angled in the picture of the gleaners. So those, I think, are the biggest influences. But you know, everything she did was a memory, so it was coming straight from her head, and it was what she saw in her mind's eye. So she wasn't really trying to copy or from any particular style, or but she just loved beauty, and that's what inspired her.
We have another statement question. I wonder about the role of art making in addressing a traumatic history within the family. In so many families, it seems the past remains submerged due to difficulty of talking about it. Could you please comment on that?
Yeah, excellent point.
Mm-hmm.
I think my mother differed from many, if not most, other Holocaust survivors in that she needed to talk about her story. Many other survivors could not and would not. Some of them were able to find the words, the voice later in their lives as they got older and more distant from the events. But my mother always had to. There was certainly no tradition of that in her family. And I don't think even in the larger village life, I mean, I've been to Poland now several times, and I've seen paintings that were done of village life in Poland in sort of a traditional, I mean, they were very skilled, much more skilled than my mother in the sense of formal training. But they had the same palette and motifs as my mother, these sort of folk realism. And so I think somewhere it was in the back of her mind, but these were not done for therapeutic purposes. They were done to celebrate village life and the culture. So I think this for my mother was unique. There was nothing in her family, nothing in her culture that that suggested that this was something to do as a memorial, even to remember. But it was what she knew how to do and what she felt she had to do.
Bernice, I got another question. Are there any other stitchers in your family now? Is anyone doing embroidery?
You know, people often ask me if I inherited my mother's talent for stitching, if I continue to stitch, or if I, do anything like this. And what I say is that my mother's talent was to create these artworks, and mine was to bring them out into the world. So I learned how to embroider, I learned how to knit and crochet, and there was a time in my life when I was very crafty and did all this stuff, but I haven't done this in a really long time. I've been busy. I've been busy doing other things.
You're very busy.
But interestingly, I'm going next month. I'm going to Montreal for a program at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and the theme of the program is textiles, women, and art. And I'm sorry, textiles, women, and the Holocaust. And the two other panelists, well, the other panelist beside me, who has a podcast that she does from New York. She is also a knitter, and her grandparents were Holocaust survivors. Her grandmother knit constantly, and she finally learned to knit as an adult, and has this very touching story about the role that it played in her life. And she has been knitting ever since. I mean, she has a whole other career, but she knits all the time. And she's now working on a book in which she's collected stories of people who, for whom knitting and some other kind of needle stitching and so on were saved their lives or helped them recover from their traumas. And so obviously my mother's work on a much bigger scale fits right into what she's been doing. So people, I tell you this because you asked about whether there's any tradition of art in my mother's family, or to deal with trauma? No, but I think dealing with trauma through what we would call craft, through something that you make with your hands, and that is part of a tradition that you come from. I think that that is perhaps universal in many cultures, including my mother's.
Let's see. How did the exhibition, or how did the work end up at the Visionary Art Museum? I'm not sure if I know that answer either.
Well, it was through personal connections, mutual friends, or relatives, family, brought the work to the attention of the museum's founding director, Rebecca Hofberger. And Rebecca fell in love with the artwork, and she wanted to, at the time that she was introduced to it, she was putting together an exhibit. This was in 2001. And she was putting together an exhibit called The Art on the theme of war and peace. And so she wanted to include as many pieces as she could, even though it was already fully planned. So she had 9 pieces that were included. And that exhibit opened at the beginning of October 2001. So 9/11 had just happened. It was an incredibly emotional and prescient exhibit, the theme. And when people came to see it and they saw the 9 pieces of my mother's, people left flowers.
Yeah.
I don't know if you knew that, Becca.
I did know that. I didn't know which exhibition, but I did hear that people left flowers. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just incredible. So after that, we had Rebecca. We did another. She was anxious to bring the entire exhibition, the entire collection, to the museum. So we did that in 2002. And then I think we did another one in 2011. And then this one is the 4th. But in between, we traveled the exhibit. We put together a traveling exhibition and took it all over. And often it went to places because people from those museums had seen the exhibition at AVAM. So AVAM really started, and Rebecca started this whole journey of the artwork.
I just wanted to add that this exhibit, when it wasn't here before it came back, it's like the most asked about artwork that the museum has ever had. I mean, we would get an email a week, like asking about the work, like, where is it? When is it coming back? So it's just really amazing, to have it on view. Another question is, does it have a permanent home, or, where is it going to go next?
An excellent question. It may live on at AVAM. We just haven't sorted that out yet, but it'll be at AVAM for a while longer, till 2020 for sure, till 2025, and it may be there beyond that date. So we don't have any plans to travel it. Our plans are all with AVAM for now.
Yeah, someone mentioned asking if it had been at other museums in the US because it's an exhibit that everyone should see. Yeah, luckily we can do programs like this to show others, and the website and the YouTube. I mean, there's so many resources, to look at as well.
I want to say also that apart from the fact that we've had the multiple exhibitions with AVAM, we've also done, we have a fantastic partnership with the museum for educational programs. And we recently did a workshop for teachers. It was, I think, the second or third one that we had done at the museum, a hands-on workshop where we shared, I did a tour of the exhibit and for teachers, and then they created their own story cloths. And of course, we shared with them the resources that are available to them through the website. And we shared with them also, or we gave them the experience of creating their own story cloths as a tool to bring back to their classrooms. This last one, or I guess in others as well, we've also partnered with an organization called Echoes and Reflections, which itself is a kind of collaboration of Yad Vashem and the Anti-Defamation League, the center at in California that was originally the the Shoah Foundation. And so they do lessons and have resources for teachers about the history of the Holocaust. So it was a great pairing of information. We had an educator from DC who is fantastic, who did background about anti-Semitism as a social phenomenon. And then we paired that with the tour of Esther's exhibit. So we've been doing great things with AVAM and others. And so it's a relationship that we hope will continue for years to come.
Yeah, we love working together. We have another program that's in the works happening on October 12th that I wanted to mention. It's going to be a free public program at the museum on October 12th. We're partnering with Stoop Storytelling in Baltimore. And we're still working out all the details of the event, but if you're around, you should mark your calendar because it's going to be a really great event with AVAM and Art and Remembrance and Stoop Storytelling.
It's going to be amazing, really.
Yeah.
It's going to be Stoop Storytelling on the theme of using art as a tool for social justice. So it will have people telling stories about their experiences with art and social injustice for social justice purposes. And then we will have a speaker, a man named Eric Ward, who is a very well-known activist around the United States, a great speaker and writer, who will, among other things, talk about the relationship. He is a Black man, and he will be talking about the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism, which is pretty profound. I think it's just going to be an amazing program. I would really encourage you, as Becca said, to mark your calendar and plan to come. Shortly, we'll have information about it on the website, and you can register for it. And as Becca said, it's free.
Yeah, and Stoop Storytelling, they are, they're looking for storytellers as well. So if that theme speaks to you, creating art, creating change stories about art as a tool for social justice, then, we can put you in touch with them. This event that we just were talking about is in person. It will be recorded, so we can, the October 12th event will be recorded, so we can get that up for you, but it is in person. It will not be on Zoom live. That was a
And I
question
would,
that just came.
yeah, obviously, those of you who are in LA or other far-flung places may not be able to make it in person. But if you're anywhere in the vicinity of the museum, I would really encourage you to come up, see the exhibit, and stay for the program.
All right. Let's see. I did a last call for any questions in the chat. Yeah, well, Bernice, we had a lovely time hearing from you. We love hearing Esther's story. I could hear it a million times, so we're really grateful to have you
You
here
have.
virtually. I know, I have, but every time I learn something new. That's the best part about, learning from you and just looking at the work so much. So um, thanks everyone for joining us, and come visit us at the museum if you can, or tune in to our website to see other events we have coming up. And thanks again, Bernice.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting.
All right. Thanks everyone, and have a great evening. Bye.